I'm currently based at Dartmouth College. I'm a fourth year PhD student in the Ecology, Evolution, Environment, and Society program.
How did you get started as a scientist?
That's a great question. I was actually an anthropology major as an undergraduate at the University of Rochester. I really thought I would study culture and people different from me. And part of the University of Rochester's anthropology program is very cultural. And I wanted to take more bio courses to learn about biological anthropology. I started taking more brain and cognitive sciences classes. And then as a result of this, I started just taking more biology focused courses and I took an animal behavior class. And this professor told me this course would change my life. And it really did. I just fell in love with animal behavior in that section of biology. I held a bird in that class for the first time. And by the time I hit my senior year of college, I was working in his lab doing a project studying parasitic wasps. And so that's really where I fell in love with being a biologist and being a scientist.
I'm going to say that's some of the creepiest stuff is those parasitic wasps. And that if your work with those creatures made you fall in love with biology, that's a whole different conversation to
Yeah,
have.
they're really small, so they're like the size of your like pinky nail. So I think that made them a little more approachable. So
Well, I'd love to talk with you more about that. But the thing,
yeah,
I want to ask one more little question about that kind of thing is there's so many people out there. Scientists and research is so important for our future as a species as the rapid climate change continues to go on with no end in sight. How would you encourage young people to pursue a career in science?
I would say if they have the opportunity and can't afford to do so, volunteer. I think that's for me what really got me into, especially the conservation aspect of science and getting out into a field and seeing it through a volunteer basis, donating your time and meet all these people who are so passionate and just are willing just to spend their time with these organisms, with these plants, animals. And that's just a great way to get involved, is just getting out there.
We've got a big paper, and it is looking at decades of data. And as I was reading through the paper, one name kept coming up for sort of research from the late 1900s. It's this Fretwell book from 1972, which sort of lays out this idea of despotic animals, and that perhaps this is part of the ongoing literature to refute that idea. Now, is that sort of a Mike, as I was looking more and more at this Fretwell book from the 70s, like, do you think that research came from a time of that generational approach to sort of society, the patriarchal approach to our culture in general of how these birds behave?
We talked a lot about the term despotism itself and actually how it comes from this sort of older, European, this idea of like a despot, someone who's ruling, like a literal king, someone who's in charge. Um, But I think Fredwell also was a big player in the ideal free distribution as well, which came out in 1969, 1970. And he was really, ideal despotic distribution came out as sort of this counterpoint to that theory, which he, developed both of them. And so I don't know if it's necessarily from a place of the patriarchy, but I think it's a place of sort of contradicting hypotheses, which is what makes science so interesting, and competing hypotheses. So
And your paper sort of says, you know what? Birds do want to get along. If they've got an abundance of the stuff that they need in one area, they seem to be willing to share that territory with others. That is how I would sort of generalize the paper's findings. Is that an accurate generalization?
yeah, I think they're capable of assessing who's around them and are able to distribute themselves in a way that allow them to, support, keep the population going. So there's not just a few individuals who are maintaining all this reproductive success. They're able to distribute themselves across a habitat, realize who's next door to them, and adjust so they understand, hey, this person has their space. It's not to my benefit to encroach on that all the time, maybe to some extent, but these birds are still territorial, of course, but they're not despotic. They're not maintaining the space. This is my only I'm the only one who can have this high quality habitat. They're adjusting as the population increases across different years.
Do you find yourself attributing emotions and feelings to these birds, like they care about the species that are next to them? Or is that something that as a scientist you try to resist thinking that they feel and are empathetic?
I really try to resist that as a scientist. I one of the things that was ingrained into me in that animal behavior course that I carry with me throughout is not to anthropomorphize the organisms you're studying. And I think, for the purpose of communicating science and explaining, hey, these birds, they're, each bird has a pair, they're like husband and wife. That's like a fun way to sort of explain that, every territory has a male and a female for the most part. But yeah, I think I try to avoid saying they're doing it for the good of the species because they care, because, in the end, I think they're trying to make sure they get the best reproductive value out of their territory. And it's energetically costly to sting all the time and to physically fight your neighbors. So I think that's where it comes from rather than this greater good.
You got to work on this paper and being a part of the Hubbard Brook research community with a person who's been doing this sort of work for a long time, over 50 years. How did you approach Dick Holmes and be like, hey, I want to do this work? Did he approach you and be like, hey, I've got this data out here. Maybe there's something you can do with it. How does that work using this long-term data in your research?
Yeah, so it was the first week of my PhD. I reached out to Dick Holmes asking, can I meet you? My advisor and I actually both went up to the bird plots and met him on the 10-hectare plot where the study takes place. And we had a conversation about the work being done. I was going to do my first summer. This was in 2021, spot mapping and actually collecting that year of data. So the final year of data in the paper I helped collect, which is funny because it's 50 years of data and I only really did the work for the last year, of course, but I did the processing of a lot of that data. When we went back to from the forest to the data barn, which is a building at Hubbard Brook where the bird crews who've been studying birds since, the 60s, 70s, they enter their data for that day. And we also store equipment there, but there's also these archives of the physical papers that we wrote these data sets on. So he pulled out these data sets and was showing me these maps from the 70s, 80s, 90s. And him and my advisor were talking about digitizing it. And I actually had some experience digitizing collections as part of my anthropology background. I worked as an archives clerk at the University of Rochester, and I worked as an intern at the Tozzer Anthropology Library at Harvard University, digitizing collections. And so I had that experience, and I said that's something I would love to digitize. And once the data is digitized, let's start thinking of a research question that we can answer because these maps have never been analyzed this way, and we have 50 years of them. So
You
that's
mentioned
how it really began.
and I'm sorry, the thing you were talking about, maybe you think about something I highlighted in the paper
Yeah.
here on my iPad, so I wanted to grab that because you talk in the paper, as all papers do, a little bit about the methodology that was used for this, including the digitization. And it does say estimated territory boundaries were drawn by the same person in each of the 52 years. So his hand was on those. I mean, do you have a feeling and emotions as you're working with some of those stuff, seeing that what he was drawing on those maps?
Absolutely. And I think the best part about it is when we talk about it, I think the following sentence in that paper discusses how it was with the collaboration of all the people who work to make these maps in the field every year. So you just picture him with students, technicians working together to figure out where the bird boundaries really are for that given year. And of course, he has the final say and he has a big handle on it, but it's just amazing to think about how many people overall looked at this data and contributed to this project and how he, has this amazing legacy with, making these maps.
Is that something that Hubbard Brook particularly offers you as a scientist? Is that feeling of I'm part of this greater process to better understand our world?
Absolutely. I think you feel it every time you step on the 10-hectare plot. You think about all the people who stepped on the plot before you. And when you get to the point where you no longer need a GPS and you just sort of know where to go, you just feel one with the forest and one with the history that comes with it.
In the paper, you also describe um, that people would go out twice a day, almost every hour in the morning at near dawn. Can you share a little? Not everybody does field work.
Yeah.
like that. It's kind of a cool thing. There must be mornings when you're like, oh, I don't want to get up this morning. But there's other mornings when you probably can't wait. What's it like to that anticipation of what am I going to find today? What am I going to hear today? How is this going to add to my work today?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, just
Is
the
that
feeling of getting up. I know you're going to do field work that day, and
yeah.
how the excitement that you feel for field work ahead of you on another day.
Yeah, it's every day is different, and eventually you get to know the birds. I think that's a big part of it. For the time census that you described, where 2 hours each week, so 1 hour time periods at two different days, you're going and you're moving down a transect, and hey, that bird's going to be there. Hey, that bird is going to be there. But sometimes there's a different bird that might come in and really shock you. And same with spot mapping, where you're wandering around the plot for maybe a couple hours each time. You're doing it for 16 hours a week across the whole week. And again, you sort of know who's going to be there. And that's kind of fun to say, hi, good to see you again. You're singing with that neighbor, but also to have some sort of surprise. If I can give a little anecdote, like this year, for example, I was mapping and there was black-throated blues, which is historically studied as part of another long-term project, but we also mark them as part of this project as well. And, I know there's a pair there and I see the male and I see the female and I walk over to a different location because I hear a different male and he was a single male who just like showed up halfway through the summer just singing his heart out. And I was like, what are you doing here? And that's fun to see.
Getting to know your neighbors.
Yeah.
So I've got some of the figures from the paper that I'm going to share my screen and we look at it because it's some of the data and it's really, really fascinating to look at. And I hope that you can share some of the insights on what this might be. So I'm going to share my screen here. First, looks like it's going to go to the Zoom tab, but I'll tab over to one of these things.
Great.
I'll close my calendar here. Don't need it. So these are the two things. This looks like it's more specific and drawn. And this is one of the things that I'm fascinated with the methodology where it says you use the iPad to trace it and then you smooth the polygons to make it into something that looks a little bit more like this. Talk about this process and what we're looking at in this figure here, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So what you're looking at are sort of not exactly a heat map, but it shows that these dark blue areas are where the birds are more likely to have their territories in these spaces. So when you have 50 years of data, we went ahead and traced these digitized maps with an iPad using Illustrator. So you make these circles in Illustrator, and then you upload them to this application we use as ArcGIS Pro. And so you have 50 years of maps in what they call layers. So it's basically just one map with 19 territories of the black-throated blue warbler from 1970. Same with 71, 72, etc. Again, for the however many years we have of that bird. And then what you can do is you overlap them and make one single map. And that's what you see here, where you can see, hey, of the 50 years of data we had for the red-eye vireo, which is the bottom center map, so the one that's alone, you can see like in the center of that map, there's these dark blue areas. So of, the 50 years of data we had for the red-eye vireo, maybe like 48 of them had a territory in that space.
How long do these birds live? How many generations of birds are we looking at here?
So I would say many of them live sometimes 1 year. They have 1 year to breed. Their chances go down by 50% every year they live. So if a bird lives a couple years, which I would say is maybe more or less average for some of these smaller birds, you know, your first year of survival, you have a 50% chance, and then 25% chance from year one to year three to year two, and so on. Uh, so I would say, yeah, maybe 2, 3 years, 1 year for some of these.
So many,
Um,
many generations of these
many
birds we're looking,
generations of
yeah.
birds.
So there's another corresponding figure that looks a bit more like this. And what are the blue dots here?
So the blue dots represent this gradient of territory size. So a small blue dot means the territory was small relative to the other territories across the 50-year time frame. Or you can see that some maps, some birds we had fewer years of data than 50 years. Many of the times because they weren't many of the times because they were not present on the plot. Like for the American red star, which is in the top left, and for the least flatcatcher, which is in the center of this figure. So small dots means the territory was small relative to other years, and larger dots represent the territory was large relative to other years. So with this figure, we're looking to see, hey, maybe large territories are always in the northern part of the territory of the plot, or small territories were always in the southern part, or maybe they're scattered, which is what we end up finding. There's no area for all seven birds, you know, where there's always large territories in this space and always small territories in that space. It's really sort of mixed, and there's a lot of variation, which is really interesting. Maybe the only bird you might see some of that is with the hermit thrush, which is all the way to the left, and it's the second bird down. So you can kind of see there's some large territories clustered together, but it's not really what we expect. As you can see, there's larger territories in other spaces as well for that bird.
So they didn't find a favorite neighborhood and just stick there. They went where the food was.
Not necessarily. I think one of the things we were expecting to see is that birds with larger territories maybe are always in the same space because maybe there's no food in that area, because they need a large territory to gain the resources they need, for example. But we don't see that. There's just sort of this an increasing variation across the plot in territory size.
I think that's what you say here. Given the high variation in territory size, there was surprisingly little spatial structure, very limited evidence for territories of similar size being grouped together, even with robust estimates. For 4 of 7 species showed no evidence of spatial autocorrelation in territory size. That's
Yeah, and that's exactly what this
yeah.
figure.
So whew, okay, then I'm looking at it thinking there was one thing you say. Where was it? Okay, so we'll get back to the findings here. First off, were you surprised personally as a researcher about some of your findings? Because the paper does actually say in there, surprisingly, I think there's a sentence in there. Anyway, what were you
Yeah,
surprised about?
I think I was not expecting them to follow an ideal free distribution. I think I really was expecting this despotism, especially for these birds where it's been, these birds are so territorial once they settle down. They're singing all the time. I've seen them physically fight. We all have, the techs who go out and study these birds. So I think despotism we thought was going to be the answer. And to see the ideal free distribution, when you really think about it, makes a ton of sense. And I think that's one of the great things about being able to do this study is to see what's actually happening.
What does this mean for why do this research? What is the goal out of it? Do you just want people to better understand their avian neighbors? Is it because forest food abundance is going to be changing as climate change goes on? And if we understand this behavior, then we have a chance of predicting how things will be in the future. What drives you to ask this question?
I think what drives me is thinking about the populations of these birds and how are they going to potentially resist or not changes to the climate, changes to their environment, and what can we maybe do to understand those population dynamics. So we show that one of the assumptions of the ideal free distribution is that birds in high and low quality territories have relatively equal fitness to one another. And so that means maybe if the bird doesn't have the best habitat, it's still going to have a chance to reproduce, which is overall great for the population. And so I think in some sense, it gives us a little hope that these birds might be able to resist small populations because they have this more equal fitness chance, if you will. And I think that's exciting. And I think to see how these birds maintain their population is the reason I like to think about this type of science.
I'll take a step back just before we get to
Yep.
the last couple of questions, which is you mentioned in the paper that there were 2 species that were included in some of the long-term data in decades prior, but then as it went on, the forest changed, and then you don't find them anymore. Is that a result of just the changing forest? Is it something that happens naturally, or is it something that should cause a little alarm for people who are thinking about how birds and what we find in the trees around where we live in our communities?
Absolutely. So the least flycatcher and the American redstart disappeared off the plot. The least flycatcher was no longer seen really after 1994. The American redstart really disappeared in the early 2000s, although it comes back sporadically. You can see there's a map from like 2008. There was a couple territories in 2021. And I don't think it's a cause for alarm. It's just because of natural forest maturation. So least flycatchers and American redstarts like a younger forest. And so as the forest aged over this 50-year study, they disappeared off the plot. Now the American redstart has come back, we think, in a couple of those years because there's maybe a giant tree fall, so there's more of this canopy gap where there's a younger sort of stand that these birds might like. But overall, they're not on the plot consistently because there's not enough of that.
Just a couple more questions. And thank you so much for taking some
Of
time
course.
today. As your semester begins and you're going to head out to your adventures in the world, um, maybe you won't tell. Did you ever have a map that you were about to scan and then something you ripped it, got tore a little bit, you bent it in a way that you didn't like? You're like, oh no, oh my gosh.
No, I didn't. But I did put a lot of consideration into how I'm going to digitize them. So I ended up using my hands. If you look at the original images of the map, you can see my fingers, which I don't love, but I had to do that. I thought about using like a stapler or a paperweight or something to put some tension on the map, but I didn't want to rip them. I think being able to control and feel the map myself and hold it like this allowed me to avoid any extra strain on the map. And, I don't wear gloves. You're not there was no need for me to do that with this type of paper. If anything, I needed to be tactile with filling the maps, making sure I know exactly how much tension I'm putting on it so I can spread it out as much as possible. Because these maps were folded up, in folders for a long time. So you have to flatten them as much as possible. Understand there's going to be a little bit of wrinklage. It's probably consistent across the entire process. So,
Did you have a favorite?
favorite map. Ooh. I really just had fun going through all these maps. I think some of the maps had notes. And that was really fun. So when, we make in everyone who's going out and collecting field, who's getting data is making their own individual maps that get compiled into this final map. So you survey all the birds, and then your data gets divvied up into the individual maps. So all the data you collected on the American redstart goes in one map, black turtle blue in another map, etc. And so I had some fun going through some of the individual maps that were getting compiled. Just, I'm not digitizing them. I'm not just, they're in these same folders or in a different folder next to the folder with the compilation maps. And there was one person who's a well-known professor now and great researcher who in 1972 drew a little picture of a deer like that he saw in the forest. And I thought that was so fun to see that. Because, we do mark mammals and chipmunks and red squirrels. It's nice to have that data. That doesn't get into its own map, but it's fun to see, someone take the time to draw a little deer while watching it and enjoying that part of the forest too, not just the birds there.
My last question for you is when you shared this with Dick, the compilation of all the maps, did you present it to him in a big way? Were you like, hey, look at this thing? Was it over time? How did you show him the compilation of all of this work from something that he's been working on for so long as a part of his career?
Yeah, so maybe I'll transition into a little bit of some of the modern technology we're
Yeah.
using now. So we're did all the data collection for this and through 2022 actually was done on pen and paper. And in 2023, in this past summer as well, we've done all the data collection using ArcGIS field maps. So we actually are digitizing this data while we're in the field. So, and then we make these maps at the end of the season. And so in 2023, when I was showing him, and I think in 2022, when we're even piloting some of this field digital methods, I was showing him that for that current year. And then also I went ahead and I said, hey, here are the maps from all the years of data. And we just went and clicked. And you can just, without putting numbers behind those maps, you can see how the territories change and shift across time. For the least flycatcher, for example, it really, they like that northern part of the plot. And you can see the years where, they're starting to dwindle in population, and maybe more of them were up in that northern part of the 10-hectare plot. And it was just really fun to like show them and go through and just, very quickly without having to whip out this species map from this folder, just go and look at it all in one place and see that progression across time. And that was really special.
Was there a glow on his face, just a smile of, oh man?
I think he enjoyed it.
I will ask one little question at the end. It says at the end of the paper that this is one little section of one little forest in the world. And how can this be extrapolated for more, or is just more research to be done? What can this lead to? What will this research lead to in the future?
I think the model that we use to test for ideal free versus ideal despotic um, distribution, looking at abundance, habitat preference, territory size. If other locations have that type of data and have maps that could be digitized and presented in that way, they can also use this model to answer this type of question and assess. And you don't need 50 years of data. I mean, the smallest data set we had was 13. That's still a lot of years, but there are places out there, not with multi-decadal patterns, but with some maps throughout years. For my PhD project, I studied the ovenbird, and I'm going to have probably 4 years of data, and I plan to like look at these similar patterns even in a shorter time frame, just to get an idea of what's happening. And I think again, more data is always better, but having even a short, time series and thinking about these patterns will be beneficial.
Thank you so much. I'm going to stop recording and then we'll just sort of wrap up off of the recording time.
Sounds great.
Thank you.